The church bells rang out over the sleepy little town, their echoes drifting across neat suburban streets and manicured lawns. It was a crisp Saturday morning in early autumn, the kind of morning that made neighbors pause in their yards just to breathe in the cool air. Inside St. Matthew's Church, sunlight poured through tall stained-glass windows, washing the wooden pews in a warm, heavenly glow. The air smelled faintly of roses and polished oak. To everyone gathered, this was a day of joy, the kind of day families waited their whole lives for. The bride, Angela White, was radiant, her ivory dress catching every glint of sunlight, as if heaven itself had chosen to spotlight her. Friends whispered about how beautiful she looked, how lucky Marcus was to marry a woman with such grace and kindness. She had a way of smiling at people that made them feel truly seen, as though their presence mattered. On this day, her smile never faltered. At the front of the church stood Marcus Turner, the groom. He looked sharp in a tailored black suit, his tie knotted just right, his posture rigid as though he had practiced this moment in front of a mirror 100 times. At 35, Marcus carried the appearance of a man who had worked hard to arrive here, steady, serious, dependable. But those who watched him closely noticed something else. Beneath his composed exterior, a shadow lingered in his eyes. It was the kind of shadow people couldn't name, but they felt it, a tension clinging to his frame like smoke. And then there was Samuel Turner, Marcus's father. At 65, Samuel was a man who had lived through storms. He had lost his wife young, raising Marcus alone with the grit of a working-class father who labored every day in construction, his hands rough and scarred from decades of work. Today, though, he looked 10 years younger. Pride radiated off him as he stood near the altar, watching his only son prepare to take his vows. This was the moment Samuel had dreamed of, seeing Marcus start his own family, finally stepping into a future brighter than the past they had endured. The ceremony began with the low hum of the organ filling the church. Angela walked slowly down the aisle, her father by her side, every step measured and graceful. Marcus's jaw tightened when he saw her, but his eyes softened for a brief flicker, betraying the depth of his feelings. Samuel, standing just a few feet away, had to blink back tears. He whispered under his breath, "Your mother would be so proud." Guests dabbed at their eyes with tissues as the vows were exchanged. The pastor spoke of love, trust, and the sacred bond of marriage. Angela's voice trembled slightly with emotion when she promised to cherish Marcus in sickness and in health, until death parted them. Marcus repeated the words, his voice steady but heavy, as if he carried a burden unseen by anyone else in the room. When the rings were slipped onto their fingers, the crowd broke into applause. The kiss was soft, tender, almost reverent. Cameras flashed. Children giggled. Old friends clapped Marcus on the back. For a fleeting moment, everything seemed perfect. After the ceremony, the guests poured into the reception hall next door. Tables were decorated with lilies and white candles. Champagne glasses clinked. Waiters carried trays of hors d'oeuvres, and the sound of laughter rose above the soft jazz playing in the background. People toasted the couple's happiness, their future children, the long life they were sure to have together. Yet in the midst of this joy, Samuel noticed something unsettling. Marcus wasn't mingling the way he usually would. Instead of sharing jokes with his cousins or thanking guests with a smile, he sat stiffly at the head table, staring out into the crowd with a distant look. His glass of champagne remained untouched. Every so often, his eyes locked on Angela as though he was studying her, memorizing her every gesture, her every word. Samuel leaned in, whispering quietly to his son. "Big day, huh? You did it, son. She's yours now. Don't let the nerves get the better of you." Marcus gave a half-smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I won't let anyone take what belongs to me, Dad," he muttered. Samuel frowned at the words, but before he could press further, Angela turned and called across the table, her voice bright as ever. "Mr. Turner, would you join me for a dance later? Marcus and I would love to have you out on the floor." Samuel chuckled, brushing aside the unease that had crept up his spine. Maybe Marcus is just overwhelmed, he thought. It's his wedding day, after all. The band began to tune up for the couple's first dance. Guests gathered near the floor, eager to watch the bride and groom take center stage. Samuel stood among them, beaming, his chest swelling with pride. In that instant, he let himself believe that all the hardship, All the years of sacrifice had led to this single, perfect moment. But behind Marcus's stiff smile, behind the glimmer of Angela's joyful eyes, something darker stirred, an invisible storm gathering strength. What no one in that room could have imagined was that before the night ended, joy would turn to horror, and Samuel would be forced to witness the unthinkable, his son's hands stained with blood, and the dream of a family shattered forever. To understand what happened on that wedding day, you have to go back, years before the bouquet toss, before the champagne glasses and the vows. You have to look at the shadows Marcus carried with him, shadows that never left his side no matter how hard he tried to outrun them. Marcus Turner grew up in a house where silence spoke louder than words. His mother, Lorraine, had left when he was just 8 years old. One morning she was there, humming along to the radio as she packed his lunch, and by nightfall she was gone, leaving behind only a note on the kitchen counter. Marcus never forgot the way his father stood there holding that piece of paper, his hands trembling, the color draining from his face. "She's not coming back, son," Samuel had said that night, his voice breaking for the first time Marcus could remember. "It's just you and me now." For years afterward, Marcus wrestled with that abandonment. He told himself he didn't care, that he didn't need her, but the wound stayed raw. And though Samuel did everything he could, working double shifts, showing up at Marcus's school games, teaching him how to drive, it was never enough to silence the whisper in Marcus's head. If your own mother could leave, anyone could. By his teenage years, that whisper grew into anger. Teachers described him as smart but restless, a boy who couldn't sit still, who bristled when challenged. He fought other boys in the locker room for looking at him the wrong way, shoved kids against lockers if they made a joke about his absent mother. At home, Samuel tried to keep him grounded. He'd sit Marcus down at the kitchen table, his voice firm but gentle. "Son, you can't live like this. Anger will eat you alive." Marcus would look away, jaw tight. "Maybe anger's all I got." And in some ways, it was. Marcus's first real relationship ended in disaster. Her name was Danielle, a girl from high school who loved his intensity, at least at first. They dated for almost 2 years, but when she broke it off, saying she couldn't handle his jealousy, Marcus spiraled. He followed her once after school, convinced she was meeting another boy. When Samuel found out, he pulled Marcus aside. "Listen to me. Love isn't about control. If you can't trust, you'll lose everything." But Marcus didn't hear the wisdom. All he felt was betrayal. All he knew was loss repeating itself. First his mother, now the girl he thought would stay. By his 20s, Marcus had built a life on the surface that looked stable. He got steady work in a factory, made friends at the gym, kept up appearances at church. People in town saw him as quiet, hard-working, a man trying to do right by his father. But underneath that calm exterior, the old scars festered. He distrusted easily, loved fiercely but possessively, and always feared that those he led in would leave him. Angela entered his life when he was 30. She was gentle, soft-spoken, with a way of easing the tension in a room. For Marcus, it felt like salvation. She laughed at his dry humor, encouraged him to open up about his dreams. For the first time in years, he let himself believe that maybe he could have something permanent, something good. Samuel, too, saw the change. He told friends at the diner, "That woman's the best thing that ever happened to my boy." But behind closed doors, cracks began to show. Marcus's insecurities lingered. If Angela came home late, he demanded to know where she'd been. If she laughed a little too long at another man's joke, he grew cold, distant. He told her once, his voice low, "Don't ever make me feel like I'm not enough. I won't be made a fool." Angela, in quiet moments with her closest friends, sometimes admitted that Marcus's intensity frightened her. One evening over coffee, her maid of honor asked gently, "Are you sure he's the one? He seems a little possessive." Angela had smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "He loves hard, that's all. He's been through so much, and sometimes it comes out the wrong way. But I can handle it. He just needs to feel safe." Still, when she lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling beside Marcus's sleeping figure, doubt crept in. She remembered the way his voice sharpened whenever she came home late, the way his eyes narrowed if she laughed too freely at a friend's joke. She wondered if this was what marriage would always feel like, walking a thin line between devotion and fear. Yet every time she considered pulling back, Marcus would show another side of himself. He would cook her dinner after a long day, or surprise her with flowers and a handwritten note. You're my everything. Don't ever forget that. It was those gestures that kept her anchored, convincing her that beneath the storm, there was love worth fighting for. To Angela, marriage was about commitment, about believing in someone even when it was difficult. She told her sister once, "He's not perfect, but none of us are. Maybe if I love him enough, he'll finally believe I won't leave." Her words were tender, full of hope, but they carried a tragic irony. Angela believed she could love away the shadows that haunted Marcus. What she didn't know was that those shadows had been growing stronger, waiting for the very day she thought would mark a new beginning. Angela tried to reassure him. She'd cup his face in her hands, whispering, "You're the only man I want, Marcus. You're my future." And for a time, those words soothed him. But deep down, Marcus never believed them fully. That whisper from childhood never left him. If your own mother could leave, anyone could. The weeks leading up to the wedding were marked by subtle tension. Angela confided in her maid of honor that Marcus seemed nervous, more on edge than usual. "It's just cold feet," she said with a nervous laugh, brushing it off. But Marcus's unease ran deeper than jitters. He couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion that even in this moment of joy, betrayal lurked around the corner. Samuel noticed it, too. One night, just a week before the wedding, he found Marcus sitting alone in the garage, a bottle of whiskey half empty beside him. "You've got everything a man could want, son," Samuel said quietly. "Don't throw it away." Marcus stared at the floor. "What if she's just like the others, Dad? What if she leaves?" Samuel put a hand on his shoulder. "Angela isn't your mother. Don't punish her for the sins of someone else." It was advice born of love, but Marcus's mind was already clouded. He wanted to believe his father. He wanted to trust Angela. But trust had never come easy for him, and the shadows of the past were louder than reason. As the wedding day approached, Marcus wore the mask of a groom, smiling for photos, shaking hands with relatives. But behind the mask, the storm was building. All it needed was a spark. The morning of the wedding broke, clear and golden. A soft breeze rustled through the trees lining Main Street, carrying the sound of church bells across the town. Guests began to gather at St. Matthew's long before the service, their voices bubbling with excitement as they straightened ties, adjusted hats, and whispered about how beautiful Angela would look walking down the aisle. Inside the small dressing room, Angela stood before a full-length mirror. Her gown flowed like liquid silk, the lace sleeves delicate against her skin. Her maid of honor fussed with her veil, laughing nervously. Angela tried to steady her breathing. "This is it," she whispered, a tremor of joy in her voice. "This is the beginning." Meanwhile, across the church, Marcus sat stiffly on a wooden bench in a room meant for the groom. His best man cracked jokes, trying to lighten the mood, but Marcus barely smiled. He smoothed his tie with methodical precision, his jaw clenched tight. In the corner of the room, Samuel watched his son quietly. He could feel the tension radiating from him like heat. "You're ready, son," Samuel said gently, as if coaxing a skittish animal. Marcus gave a slow nod, though his eyes didn't soften. "I won't let anyone take this from me." The words should have sounded like determination, but they carried a sharper edge. Samuel's brows knit together, but before he could say more, the usher appeared at the door. "It's time." The church filled with music as the guests rose to their feet. Angela appeared at the back of the aisle, her father proudly guiding her forward. Gasps rippled through the crowd. She was radiant, her smile wide and genuine, her eyes fixed on Marcus. For that moment, every doubt, every whisper of fear melted away. Marcus's face shifted. His lips curved into something that resembled a smile, but his eyes flickered with something deeper, darker. Still, he reached for her hand when she arrived at the altar, gripping it tightly, almost possessively. The pastor spoke in a calm, measured voice, words about love, fidelity, and the bond that would hold them together until death. Angela's voice trembled with emotion when she recited her vows. "I promise to love you with all that I am, to honor you, to cherish you, to be your partner in this life until the day we leave this world." A hush fell as Marcus began his vows. His voice was steady, but it carried a weight that made some guests exchange quick glances. "I promise to never let go, to hold what is mine, to protect it, no matter the cost." Angela blinked, surprised by the phrasing, but she smiled anyway, choosing to hear devotion instead of warning. The pastor continued, and when the rings were slipped onto their fingers, the congregation erupted into applause. Cameras flashed, children giggled, and Samuel felt his heart swell with pride. "You may kiss the bride," the pastor announced. Marcus leaned in, pressing his lips to Angela's. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed perfectly still. The kiss was tender, almost reverent, as though Marcus wanted to prove, both to himself and to the watching crowd, that she truly belonged to him. The reception hall next door was alive with color and sound. Tables draped in white linen, vases of lilies and roses, candles flickering. Guests raised glasses high as the band played softly in the background. Angela moved from table to table, hugging relatives, laughing with friends, her joy infectious. Marcus trailed behind, offering stiff smiles, shaking hands without warmth. His eyes rarely left Angela. Every time she laughed, every time she leaned close to hear someone speak, his gaze sharpened. Samuel, seated at a nearby table, felt unease creep into his chest. During a quiet moment, Samuel leaned toward his son. "You've got a good woman, Marcus. Don't let your mind ruin what's in front of you." Marcus looked at him, his eyes cold and unblinking. "She's mine, and I won't be made a fool, not by her, not by anyone." The words lodged in Samuel's chest like a stone. He tried to shake it off, to focus on Angela's glowing face, on the laughter around him. But in the pit of his stomach, he sensed it. Something was wrong. As the evening stretched on, the band announced the couple's first dance. Guests crowded around the dance floor, cameras poised, smiles wide. Angela reached for Marcus's hand, her face glowing with love. And though he took her hand, though he stepped onto the polished floor, Marcus's expression was unreadable. Behind the groom's polite smile, behind the bride's radiant joy, a storm was building, silent but relentless. The reception should have been pure joy. Laughter bounced off the high ceilings of the hall. The clink of champagne glasses rang like bells, and children darted between tables chasing one another while their parents danced. Angela floated among the guests, her white gown trailing like a comet's tail, her cheeks flushed with happiness. To everyone around her, she was the picture of a bride basking in the glow of her perfect day. Marcus, however, was anything but glowing. He sat at the head table, his body rigid in his chair, watching the room as though it were a battlefield. His eyes tracked Angela wherever she went, smiling with her cousins, hugging an aunt, laughing at something whispered by her maid of honor. Each time she laughed, his jaw tightened, and his hand curled into a fist beneath the tablecloth. Samuel, seated a few chairs away, tried to break the tension. He leaned toward his son with a warm smile. "Relax, Marcus. This is your night. Look at her. She's over the moon. You should be, too." Marcus gave a short, humorless laugh. "You don't know what I know, Dad." Samuel frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" But Marcus only shook his head, his eyes snapping back to Angela, who was now twirling a flower girl in her arms. At one point, Angela slipped into a seat beside him, touching his hand. "Are you all right? You've hardly touched your food." "I'm fine," Marcus said flatly, pulling his hand back. "Just watching." Angela's smile faltered, confusion flickering in her eyes, but she brushed it off. She kissed his cheek lightly and returned to the crowd, determined not to let her new husband's mood shadow the day. As the evening rolled on, the band picked up tempo. Couples filled the dance floor, laughter and music rising in waves. Angela's best friend leaned in close, whispering, "Your groom looks tense. You sure he's okay?" Angela forced a laugh. "He's always like this when he's nervous. He'll settle down." But even she couldn't ignore the unease creeping into her chest. Every time she looked over, Marcus's eyes were on her, hard and unblinking, like a man guarding something he feared losing. When the servers brought out the wedding cake, the guests gathered in a semicircle, phones raised high. Angela giggled as Marcus's hand covered hers on the knife. They cut the first slice, the crowd cheering as she playfully smeared a bit of frosting on his cheek. The room erupted in laughter. Marcus didn't laugh. He wiped the frosting away with a slow, deliberate motion, his eyes locking with Angela's. For a split second, the joy drained from her face. Samuel noticed. He excused himself from a conversation with a cousin and stepped closer to his son. His voice was low but firm. "Marcus, don't you dare ruin this. You've got the best thing that's ever happened to you. Don't let your demons take her from you." Marcus's response was chilling in its calmness. No one's taking her. I'll make sure of it. The words settled like ice in Samuel's gut. He opened his mouth to say more, but the band's announcement cut through the room. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the bride and groom's first dance. The crowd applauded, moving toward the dance floor. Angela's face lit up, her hand reaching instinctively for Marcus's. He hesitated, then stood, his movements stiff, his expression unreadable. Samuel watched him walk onto the polished floor, his heart pounding with dread. The band began a slow, melodic tune. Angela pressed close to her husband, her eyes shining with love. "This is our moment," she whispered. Marcus held her tightly, too tightly. His grip around her waist felt more like a restraint than an embrace. Guests swayed in admiration, snapping pictures, sighing at how beautiful the couple looked under the lights. To them, it was a romantic picture of new love. To Samuel, it looked like a storm about to break. He couldn't shake the thought that had haunted him all night. Marcus wasn't dancing with his bride. He was clinging to her, as though she might slip away at any moment. And deep inside, Samuel knew something terrible was coming. The first notes of the song floated through the reception hall, soft and lilting, the kind of tune meant to steady nerves and melt hearts. Guests swayed at the edges of the dance floor, their faces glowing with affection as they watched the newlyweds. Cameras flashed, capturing what everyone believed would be the couple's most treasured memory. Angela rested her head against Marcus's chest, her smile radiant. "See," she whispered, "this is everything we dreamed of." But Marcus's body was rigid. His arms tightened around her waist with a grip that made her shift uneasily. His eyes weren't on her. They were fixed on some invisible point beyond the room, his mind somewhere darker. Angela pulled back slightly, searching his face. "Marcus, what's wrong?" He leaned in close, his lips brushing her ear, his voice a low growl. "You think I don't know? You think I haven't seen the way you look at people? The way you hide things from me?" Angela froze. "What are you talking about?" "Marcus, this is our wedding. Don't lie to me." His whisper was sharp, venomous, the words like a knife pressed against her throat. The guests clapped along to the music, oblivious, smiling at what they thought was a romantic exchange. Samuel, however, wasn't fooled. From the edge of the dance floor, he saw the storm brewing in his son's eyes. He stepped forward, but the crowd closed in, blocking his path. Angela's heart pounded. She tried to keep her voice steady. "I love you. You're my husband now. Nothing else matters." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You don't get it. If I can't have you, no one will." The words turned her blood cold. Before she could respond, Marcus's hand slipped inside his jacket. Her breath caught as she felt the hard press of metal against her side. "Marcus, no," she whispered urgently. "Please, not here." But it was too late. With a sudden, violent motion, Marcus pulled the gun from his coat. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the gleam of steel caught the light. For one suspended heartbeat, the entire hall seemed frozen. Angela's eyes widened in terror. Samuel's voice tore through the silence, raw and desperate. "Marcus, don't you dare." Then the gunshot cracked like thunder. Angela's body jerked violently in Marcus's arms. Her bouquet tumbled to the floor, petals scattering like spilled blood. For a moment, her white dress seemed to hold her upright, but then she collapsed, crumpling to the ground in a heap of lace and crimson. Screams erupted. Guests scattered, overturning chairs and knocking over glasses. The band stopped mid-note. Children wailed as parents dragged them away from the horror unfolding at the center of the room. Marcus stood above his bride's fallen body, the gun still smoking in his hand. His chest heaved, his face twisted with rage and despair. "She betrayed me," he roared. "She thought she could make a fool of me." Samuel shoved through the panicked crowd, falling to his knees beside Angela. He gathered her into his arms, pressing his hand against the wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. Tears streaked down his weathered face. "Stay with me, baby. Please, God, stay with me." Angela's lips moved, faint and trembling. Tell my family. I love them." Her eyes fluttered, then went still. Samuel let out a sound no father should ever have to make. A howl of grief so raw it cut through the chaos, silencing the room for one heart-wrenching moment. Marcus staggered backward, the gun trembling in his grip. His eyes darted wildly from face to face, as if searching for someone to justify what he had done. Guests cowered, some whispering prayers, others too shocked to move. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Samuel rose to his feet, still covered in Angela's blood, and faced his son. His voice cracked with fury. "You didn't just kill her, Marcus. You killed me. You killed us all." Marcus shook his head violently, tears streaking his face now. "I had no choice. Don't you see? She would have left, just like Mom. She would have abandoned me. You don't know that." Samuel roared. "You destroyed the only good thing you ever had." The doors burst open as officers flooded the hall, weapons drawn. "Drop the gun," one shouted. For a moment, Marcus hesitated, the weight of the weapon dragging his hand lower. His chest rose and fell in ragged bursts, his mind spinning between surrender and defiance. Then, with a strangled sob, he let the gun slip from his fingers. It clattered against the floor, the sound echoing through the hall like the final note of a dirge. Two officers rushed forward, tackling him to the ground. Marcus didn't fight. He lay limp as they cuffed his wrists, his eyes locked on Angela's lifeless body. Samuel turned away, unable to look at his son. His hands shook as he pressed them against his face, the blood of his daughter-in-law staining his skin. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a cliff, his entire world crumbling beneath him. The guests, pale and trembling, began to file out in silence, leaving overturned chairs, broken glasses, and blood-stained petals in their wake. The hall that had been filled with joy only minutes before now reeked of gunpowder and death. As Marcus was dragged past him, Samuel's voice came again, quieter now, but laced with despair. "You were supposed to be better than this, son. You were supposed to build a life, not destroy one." Marcus turned his head slightly, his eyes hollow. "I loved her, Dad. That's why I did it." Samuel closed his eyes, the words cutting deeper than any blade. For the first time in his life, he wished he hadn't lived long enough to see this day. The hall emptied slowly, like a house draining of life. The air still carried the acrid bite of gunpowder, mingled with the sickly sweet scent of flowers knocked from their vases. Blood spread across the polished dance floor, staining the white petals that had been scattered there only hours earlier. The music had long since stopped, leaving behind a suffocating silence broken only by the occasional sob of a lingering guest. Samuel stayed where he was, kneeling in the center of it all, his hands shaking as they hovered uselessly over Angela's still form. The weight of her head against his lap felt impossibly heavy, as though the earth itself had collapsed inside her body. He whispered her name again and again, hoping she might stir, hoping it was all some hideous mistake. But the truth was carved into her lifeless face, and Samuel felt the ground beneath his world split apart. Police officers moved carefully through the scene, cordoning off the area with yellow tape, their radios crackling with clipped commands. Paramedics arrived, but their steps slowed as they approached, their faces falling when they saw there was nothing left to save. "Sir," one of them said softly, placing a hand on Samuel's shoulder, "we need to take her now." Samuel's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. "No, don't touch her. Not yet." His voice cracked, and for a moment, he looked like a man who had aged 20 years in the span of minutes. The paramedic backed away, giving him time. Across the hall, Marcus sat slumped in a chair, his wrists bound in steel cuffs, two officers flanking him. His once pristine suit was wrinkled, his tie askew, his eyes vacant. He rocked slightly, muttering to himself. "She lied, she was going to leave. I couldn't let her go." One officer shifted uncomfortably, muttering under his breath, "God, he doesn't even realize what he's done." Cameras soon appeared outside, reporters swarming like vultures sensing fresh carrion. By nightfall, news outlets across the state were running headlines. "Bride killed at wedding reception, groom in custody." The story spread like wildfire, each retelling more sensational than the last. People who had never heard the name Marcus Turner before that day now spoke it with horror, shaking their heads as though trying to make sense of the impossible. Back inside, Samuel finally allowed the paramedics to move Angela. As they lifted her gently onto a stretcher, his hands hovered in the air, wanting to reach for her one last time. When they wheeled her through the double doors, he collapsed into a chair, his body racked with silent sobs. An officer approached cautiously. "Mr. Turner, we need your statement." Samuel lifted his face, streaked with tears, his eyes hollow. "You want my statement?" he rasped. I'll give it to you. My son murdered his wife in front of me. That's my statement. The wedding guests, many of them still trembling, remained huddled in the parking lot long after the sirens had faded. Some were barefoot, having run from the hall without their shoes. Others clutched children tightly to their chests, shielding them from questions too heavy for young hearts. The bright ribbons and balloons tied along the church fence now looked grotesque, mocking the tragedy that had unfolded inside. A young flower girl, no more than 7 years old, sobbed uncontrollably in her mother's arms. "Why did Mr. Marcus hurt her?" she cried. Her mother had no answer. All she could do was rock the child back and forth, whispering, "It's over now, baby. It's over." But deep down she knew it wasn't over. Not for the children who had seen the bride collapse. Not for the guests who had watched joy transform into horror. An elderly aunt of Angela's stood trembling against the hood of a car, her hands still stained with frosting from the cake she had been serving. "I saw her laughing, just moments before," she murmured, her voice hollow. How can laughter turn into a gunshot so quickly? Inside the hall, detectives interviewed witnesses one by one. Many were too shaken to speak clearly. A groomsman stammered. He looked like he wasn't even there, like his eyes belonged to someone else. The maid of honor, her makeup streaked with tears, whispered, "Angela told me he'd been acting strange, but she thought it was nerves. I should have pushed her harder. I should have told someone." Outside, the news crews circled, thrusting microphones toward anyone willing to speak. Most turned away. A few muttered that they would never step inside St. Matthew's again without hearing that gunshot echo in their ears. For them, the church was no longer a place of vows and hope, but the site of a nightmare that would follow them home. The tragedy had not only destroyed 2 families, it had scarred an entire community. And in the days to come, everyone who had witnessed that moment would carry a piece of it. A reminder that sometimes the greatest horrors do not come from strangers, but from the people we trust the most. The officer nodded solemnly, jotting it down. There was nothing else to say. As Marcus was led past his father, their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Marcus's lips trembled. "Dad, I had to. She would have left me, like Mom did. I couldn't let that happen." Samuel's voice came out low, guttural. "You don't understand, do you? She didn't leave you. You killed her." The words seemed to slice through Marcus, but instead of breaking, he only shook his head, retreating further into the prison of his delusion. The officers tightened their grip and hauled him away, his figure shrinking until he vanished through the doors. In the days that followed, the town was consumed by shock. The church that had rung its bells in celebration that morning now hosted candlelight vigils. Strangers left flowers on the steps, murmuring prayers for Angela, shaking their heads in disbelief at how joy had curdled into tragedy in mere hours. Samuel avoided the crowds. He spent his days sitting alone in his small house, staring at the empty chair across from him. The silence was unbearable. He replayed the night over and over. The vows, the kiss, the dance, the gunshot. Each memory felt like a cruel trick, dangling happiness in front of him only to rip it away. Neighbors came by with casseroles, offering condolences in hushed voices. Samuel thanked them, but the words felt hollow. Food couldn't fill the void left in his chest. Nothing could. At night, he sat at his kitchen table, a single lamp casting long shadows. He opened an old notebook, his handwriting unsteady as he tried to capture the storm inside him. "I watched my son destroy himself. I watched him kill the woman who could have saved him. I lost them both in one night. I don't know how to live with that." Meanwhile, Marcus sat alone in a county jail cell. The bravado that had carried him through the shooting was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. Inmates whispered about him. The groom who had shot his bride in her wedding dress. Some mocked him. Others kept their distance, unnerved by the emptiness in his eyes. When detectives questioned him, Marcus repeated the same refrain. "She was going to betray me. I couldn't let her." They pressed him for proof, for evidence of betrayal, but he had none. Only suspicions, only ghosts from his past that had followed him into the present. For Samuel, the hardest part was knowing this wasn't some random act of violence. It wasn't a stranger in the night or a senseless accident. It was his own flesh and blood, the boy he had raised with calloused hands and a hopeful heart. He had prayed Marcus would find peace, but instead, he had brought ruin. And deep down, Samuel carried a question he couldn't silence. Was there something I could have done to stop it? The world around him moved on. News cycles churned. Neighbors returned to their routines. But Samuel remained frozen in that moment, hearing the echo of the gunshot, feeling the weight of Angela's head in his lap, seeing the look in his son's eyes as he was led away in chains. It was a moment he would never escape, no matter how many years passed. By the time the trial began, nearly a year had passed since the wedding day that had ended in blood. Yet for the people of the town, the memory remained raw. They crowded the courthouse steps, clutching newspapers, murmuring about what they had seen or heard. For them, the trial was not just about justice. It was about making sense of the senseless. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Reporters filled the benches, their pens poised. Family members and former friends of Angela sat together, united in grief. At the center of it all sat Marcus Turner, shackled at the wrists, his once proud figure diminished. He wore a plain gray suit provided by the county jail, his hair longer now, his face gaunt. He looked less like the groom of a year ago and more like a ghost of himself. At the prosecution's table sat the district attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen Mitchell, known for her ruthless pursuit of justice in high-profile cases. She spoke with precision, her every word clipped and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice echoing through the chamber. "This case is not complicated." On his wedding day, in front of hundreds of witnesses, including his own father, the defendant pulled a gun from his jacket and executed his bride. This was not an accident. This was not a momentary lapse. It was murder. Across the aisle, Marcus's defense attorney, a weary public defender named Daniel Ross, rose to counter. His voice was softer, almost apologetic. "My client has lived a life marked by trauma, abandonment, and paranoia. He was not in his right mind when this tragedy occurred. This is not the story of a cold-blooded killer, but of a man who lost his grip on reality." The courtroom listened, but their eyes kept flicking toward Marcus. He sat unmoving, his expression unreadable, as though he were watching someone else's trial. The testimony began with guests from the wedding, each recounting the horror of that night. Voices trembled as they described Angela's laughter moments before the gunshot, the way Marcus's face hardened, the way Samuel's cries filled the hall. Some jurors winced, others shook their heads in disbelief. But the most anticipated testimony was Samuel's. When his name was called, the old man rose slowly from his seat, leaning on the wooden railing for balance. Every eye in the courtroom followed him as he walked to the stand. His face was lined with grief, his shoulders stooped beneath the invisible weight of loss. He raised his hand, swore the oath, and sat down. For a moment, he said nothing, staring at the floor as though summoning the strength to speak. Then, in a voice roughened by both age and sorrow, he began. "I was there," he said simply. "I watched my son marry the woman he claimed to love. I saw the joy in her eyes. And then I watched him take it all away." Karen Mitchell stepped closer, her tone gentle. "Mr. Turner, can you tell the jury what you witnessed that night?" Samuel's eyes flicked toward Marcus, who stared back at him without emotion. Samuel's hands trembled as he spoke. He pulled a gun. "Right there, on the dance floor." Angela begged him, but he didn't listen. "I tried to stop him. I yelled his name, but he shot her anyway. She died in my arms." His voice cracked, and he paused, swallowing hard. "I lost my daughter-in-law that night. And I lost my son, too." A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the reporters paused their pens. Karen nodded. "And in your own words, Mr. Turner, was this an accident?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "No, it was deliberate. He knew what he was doing." The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, his voice careful. "Mr. Turner, isn't it true that your son has suffered from paranoia for many years? That he feared abandonment, ever since his mother left?" Samuel's eyes closed briefly. "Yes, he carried that pain his whole life." "And isn't it possible," Ross pressed, "that on that night, he wasn't in control of himself? That he was acting out of delusion rather than intent?" Samuel looked directly at his son. For a long moment, father and son locked eyes, one filled with despair, the other with a hollow emptiness. Then Samuel spoke, each word deliberate. "Delusion doesn't pull a trigger. My son did." A ripple passed through the room. Some jurors nodded. Angela's family wept quietly. The trial continued for weeks, with psychiatrists debating Marcus's mental state, experts arguing over legal definitions of intent. But no matter how technical the discussions grew, The image of that blood-stained wedding dress hovered in every juror's mind. When closing arguments came, Karen Mitchell's voice rang with finality. Marriage is built on trust, on love, on protection. Marcus Turner turned his marriage into a coffin. He chose control over compassion, violence over love, and Angela paid the price with her life. Ross's final plea was softer, almost defeated. He is a broken man. Do not condemn him without remembering the scars he carried long before this tragedy. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady. We find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. A murmur swept the courtroom. Angela's family clutched each other, sobbing. Samuel sat stone still, his face pale, as though he had expected nothing less but dreaded hearing it aloud. The judge delivered the sentence: life in prison without parole. Marcus didn't flinch. He simply lowered his head, muttering words no one could hear. To the world, it looked like resignation. To Samuel, it looked like the final severing of the son he once knew. As the bailiffs led Marcus away, Samuel whispered to himself, I testified against my own blood. And still, there is no justice here. Only ashes. When the trial ended and the courthouse emptied, the town exhaled as though it had been holding its breath for a year. For the jurors, the verdict brought relief. For Angela's family, the sentence was a small measure of justice. But for Samuel Turner, there was no relief, no victory, only the echo of a gunshot and the memory of his son's eyes as he was led away in chains. Life after the trial moved on for most people. The headlines faded, the reporters packed up, and another tragedy somewhere else replaced this one in the endless cycle of news. But in Samuel's house, time stood still. The armchair where Angela had once sat during visits remained untouched. Her photograph, framed in white lace, sat on the mantelpiece, a reminder of the daughter-in-law he had lost. Each morning, Samuel visited the cemetery. He knelt before Angela's grave, brushing leaves from the stone, speaking softly to her, as if she were listening. I'm sorry, he would whisper. I couldn't save you. I couldn't save him either. His words carried into the wind, swallowed by silence. In the evenings, he returned home to an empty kitchen. He would heat up a can of soup, sit at the table, and open the old notebook he had begun after the wedding. His handwriting was shaky, but the words poured out. How does a father grieve 2 children at once? One buried beneath the earth, the other locked behind bars. I raised him with everything I had, but in the end, I raised a man who destroyed the one person who loved him unconditionally. Sometimes, late at night, he replayed the trial in his mind. He could still hear his own voice on the witness stand. Delusion doesn't pull a trigger. My son did. The words haunted him. He had spoken the truth, but it felt like a betrayal. He wondered if Marcus hated him for it, or if Marcus even understood. Marcus, meanwhile, settled into prison life with a strange calm. Guards described him as quiet, withdrawn, rarely speaking except to mutter about betrayal and abandonment. To the outside world, he was just another inmate, another broken man swallowed by the system. But to Samuel, he was still his boy, the boy he had taught to ride a bike, the boy who had cried when his mother left. On rare nights when Samuel could sleep, he dreamed of both Angela and Marcus. In those dreams, they were whole again, Angela laughing, Marcus smiling, the 3 of them sharing a meal at the old kitchen table. Then he would wake, the house empty, the silence deafening. The town remembered the tragedy too. Each year, on the anniversary of Angela's death, the church bells rang, not for celebration but for mourning. People left candles on the church steps, a quiet reminder that love, when twisted by fear and obsession, could turn lethal. Samuel grew older, his hair silvering completely, his steps slower. But he continued his ritual, the grave, the notebook, the silence. In his final entry, written with trembling hands, he confessed the truth that had lived inside him since that night. I thought I had lost my wife when Marcus was a boy. I thought raising him alone was the greatest trial of my life. But nothing could compare to losing him like this. I have no son, no daughter-in-law, no family left. Only the ashes of what could have been. The story of Marcus and Angela faded from the headlines, but in Samuel's heart, it never ended. For him, every day was still that wedding day. Every morning the joy, every night the gunshot. And so, the tragedy lingered, not as a headline or a cautionary tale, but as the enduring grief of a father who watched love die in front of him. In the end, this story is not only about one man's crime, but about the silence of wounds never healed. Marcus Turner grew up fearing abandonment, carrying the scars of a mother who walked away. He carried them like an invisible weight into every relationship, into his marriage, and ultimately into his wedding day. Those scars, unchecked, became a weapon. For Angela White, the cost was her life. She walked down the aisle believing love was enough to tame the shadows in her husband's heart. She believed devotion could silence suspicion. But love, when held hostage by fear, becomes a cage. And in that cage, Angela never had a chance to survive. For Samuel Turner, the tragedy was twofold. He lost the daughter-in-law who had brought light into his family, and he lost the son he had sacrificed everything to raise. His grief is the echo left behind for every parent who wonders whether love and guidance are ever enough. His story reminds us that sometimes, despite all effort, darkness finds its way through. The town will remember the white dress turned red, the sound of gunfire over music, the church bells that once rang with joy but now toll each year with mourning. The guests will remember the screams, the children will remember the fear in their parents' eyes, and the community will carry the memory like a scar they never asked for. And for the rest of us, those who listen, those who watch from afar, it is a reminder of how quickly devotion can twist into obsession and how obsession can turn into violence. It is a reminder that love cannot survive where there is no trust, and that silence about fear or abuse can be just as deadly as the act itself. What began as a wedding day ended as a cautionary tale, not about strangers or fate, but about the danger that grows when suspicion is left to rot in the shadows of the heart.